Josh, you ready? You online?
Yes, I am.
Great. So Josh is going to talk to us today about the analyst artist. So whenever you're ready, Josh, take it away.
A big thank you to the entire crew that is running the Fringe Festival today and CloudStream Analytics. And the more involved I get with the Fringe Festival, the more I realize that there is quite a crew that's doing it. So again, thank you for all the effort you're putting into this. I also want to let people know, this isn't a technical presentation, so I think it'd be easier for answers to show up toward the end. So feel free to toss those in the Q&A. I'll get to those at the end of this deck. I'd like to highlight first the goals of this presentation as we talk about the artist analyst. First off, the aim of this isn't for me to say, look, I'm an artist and look what I'm doing. I'm going to talk about some of the art that I've done, but really what I'm trying to do is look at what some of the amazing leaders have said in our field around us being artists, and wanting to really highlight Mike Cisneros' talk. One of the most inspirational videos I've ever seen. It's titled "You Are an Artist," and that's available on YouTube through the Tableau Conference 2018. Highly recommend that. What I want to do is to carry that vision forward and to explore what the label of artist means, and hopefully to let us think about what we're doing from a slightly different perspective, how we think and how we behave. A little bit just for credibility, or maybe it'll diminish my credibility to talk about why I'm talking about art. First thing to note that I have up there, 2 times I've dropped out of graduate school, but I did get quite a bit of an education as I went through those, and a lot in undergrad. So one of my grad programs was in folklore and creative writing in an English lit program. The other one was in biostatistics. I dropped out of both of those because other opportunities in life were coming up and I wouldn't have been able to take advantage of those. And so my life is better having done that. Don't recommend other people try going to grad school, getting a bunch of debt and then dropping out to get to where I'm at by any means. But there's things I have done in art through those graduate programs and also on my own. So I do have 5 published poems. That's not necessarily something that a very well-known poet will shout about. They usually don't talk about the number of poems. And so a key thing there is that I'm practicing. I'm not a huge name in any of these spaces, but I do practice. I do like to challenge myself in other paradigms besides just the data viz community we're in. I studied creative writing that was, again, mainly focused on poetry. Took a number of classes in photography, both film and digital, and then also dance, both modern and hip hop. Please, if you see me at Tableau Conference, do not ask me to dance. It's quite embarrassing, and I will refuse repeatedly. So that is something that I've practiced in all of these different areas. And so I learned a lot about art, and especially from brilliant teachers and other artists, people I was in class with that have gone on to have good names and to be recognizable names in their fields of dance and poetry and photography. And being able to witness what they do and listen to them and learn from them has been a huge part of my understanding of what it means to be an artist. I want to break it down into 5 pieces here. What does it mean to be an artist? It means to see the world differently. It means we create something original. It means we master the form. We are part of a conversation and we have a responsibility. So I want to start with that first chunk. Here's a really interesting quote from Kim Adonisio, a poet. Poetry isn't what we think of as the ordinary. What we feel and sense is underneath the ordinary or inside it or passing through it. A poem is about both the ordinary and the extraordinary at the same time. It's a very powerful quote, but we can switch the word poetry with data viz, right? Data viz isn't what we think of as the ordinary, but we feel and sense is underneath the ordinary or inside it or passing through it. A viz is about both the ordinary and the extraordinary at the same time. A lot of times we're making things like dashboards out of data that seems really uninteresting, right? Think about the business dashboards we build. And if we tell the public, yeah, I make banking dashboards, or I make dashboards for healthcare, I accumulate claims data. and show that. That doesn't sound interesting. And that's part of our job, is to look through what seems really, really ordinary and boring and to make something extraordinary. That's one of the things that artists do, is they look for beauty, they look for truth, and look for meaning in everything, and even things that are mundane. So highlighting two examples here, right? One from Mike and Lilac is an entire visualization on poop, right? Something that's even gross to think about, and they've turned such a visualization into something that's so compelling, so aesthetically pleasing, something that you want to look at and engage with and play with. And then looking at Ludovic's piece, the one that won him a spot at the Iron Viz at Tableau Conference 2018, was just on the letter E. Now, if I were looking at a paper that someone had written about the letter E, was an entire, let's say, everything that Ludovic has in there in terms of visualizations, let's say you could turn that into a 20 to 30 page paper. I would never read that. I would never think a 20 to 30 page paper on just one letter is interesting. I'm sure there are people out there that that's different for, but I think for the large majority of us, a single letter and where that appears in these patterns isn't necessarily an extraordinary piece of data. But here we are, so engaged and drawn into something that Ludovic made, all on something that seems really banal and really boring. He made it interesting. He made it compelling. Same thing with Mike and Lilac. They're taking these things that don't seem interesting and showing it to us a way that's so engaging we can't help but look and engage and play. There's a few things that I've learned from my classes and from the other artists that we can do to see the world a bit differently. The first one is stop. This is in every book I've read about making art. Stop, let yourself daydream, meditate, find solitude, let your brain go in different directions. Read a really interesting article the other day about creativity and why a lot of us think that we aren't creative. And I want to reaffirm that I don't think I've ever met someone that's actually not creative. I've met a lot of people that don't think they're creative. I don't think I've ever met someone that's actually not creative. But we live in a world where busyness is often equated with a moral standard of hard working. And so as long as we're busy, we're working hard. And that's something that crushes our creativity. So finding time to stop, letting our brain wander, letting our brain explore different parts of the world, and even from a different perspective than we normally do. The next one is observe. Everything you see, take note of. Kim Adonisio talks about having this little book that you can carry with you, and you just make notes all day long. If you see something interesting, print it off and tape it to the inside of that notebook. Constantly be making notes about what you see around you. I've heard that in every single poetry workshop, or part of the class assignment was carry around a notebook and just observe the world around you. It's people, it's nature, but really the key thing here is taking time to notice. Then the last one is connecting the dots, right? The idea that mastering metaphors is really a key piece to being an artist. When you see someone walking down the street, what does that bring to mind? I was in a poetry workshop, one of my very first, and I wanted to do something that I think almost every poet does when they start out writing. I wanted to write a love poem to my who would be my wife. And I wrote this love poem that was honestly, I swear you could have ripped it off the front of a Hallmark card. I was very proud of it, and the professor was very careful to point out that it wasn't good. And he said it in a way that didn't really hurt my feelings too much. But the problem was that I didn't connect anything for the reader. I didn't make it real. He said that a true love poem would be something like creating an image, sitting on a park bench at 2 a.m. talking about Matchbox cars, right? He said that's so specific. A reader can envision themselves on a park bench with a loved one at 2 a.m. talking about something that's mundane. The Matchbox cars isn't what's key there. It's really drawing these connections between what we see, what's abstract, and then some sort of a real image. So connecting those dots and being in the practice of finding real life metaphors is a key thing that artists do to see the world differently. The next is creating something original. One of my favorite quotes, "Cliché is at the root of audience dissatisfaction." Robert McKee's talking about a lot of movies we go to and we're just not happy when we leave. And he pinpoints that as an issue of cliche. So we create things that are very different, things people have never seen before. That's one of the key things of an artist. I've highlighted Alex here and Johnny. These are two charts that were just so novel to me. I never even thought about presenting data in these ways, right? Taking something that we could show in bars or lines or some sort of a pie chart, right? Those are, I'm going to say cliche, and not that they're bad. And I'm going to talk about where cliches can be important and helpful, but these are completely different. Not only are they mind-blowing from a technological perspective, but they're just something we've never encountered before, right? That's something an artist does. Now, creating something original doesn't mean it has to be technologically savvy or sophisticated. Part of it is having your own tone, your own style, your own voice. When someone can see a piece of work, they should be able to say that they know it's yours. Someone pointed out in a group that I'm going to talk about later, someone pointed out to me that my tone and my style is blending images with visualizations. And they pointed that out and I'd never noticed it before, but now I'm looking back like, yes, that is something that I do. And so here's a few examples. The Captain Marvel viz, mixing space with objects that kind of look like the density of a black hole. My Western viz using a bar plot to look like there's a setting sun behind it. This awesome mixtape, right? That little tape inside there is actually a little donut chart, and you can see how long each song is. There's a bullseye target in my Western viz as well. We have something that looks like records. This one down here in the bottom middle there, where you have, it looks like confetti coming out of Star-Lord's gun. That was completely on accident, but when I set the image down and laid it there, it happened to fall there and actually made me chuckle out loud. And I decided that, look there, we have something that looks like the gun is firing, and that's going to draw people's attention to that visualization. And then the bottom right looks like a Gantt chart that looks like smoke coming out of a fired pistol, right? All of these are weaving graphic images in with the data visualization itself. That's something that someone pointed out is a way that they recognize my work. I might not be making something that's technologically sophisticated, and I don't need to, and none of us need to. There are other ways we can create something that looks and feels like our work. That's part of making something original, is having your own tone, style, and voice. How can you go about creating something original? The first one is exploring your ideas. Robert McKee, when he's talking about cliche, he goes on to say that really the problem when we have a cliche is that we just haven't explored the idea far enough. If you make something that looks like every other viz out there, that doesn't mean that you don't know how to make a good viz. It just means you haven't entertained your own ideas enough. You haven't explored your story. Start diving into it. Let your brain wander. Give the creative abilities inherent in all of us room to breathe and room to grow. And then you might start to see things a little bit differently. It might not mean you don't use a bar chart or a line chart, but it might mean that you present those in a different way that people haven't seen before, or a way that's unique to yourself. Really explore those and let those grow. The next one is letting your work surprise you. That one, it's a common phrase in art that if your art doesn't surprise you, how is it going to surprise your audience? There's this idea of giving ourselves the forgiveness to chase curiosity, right? I'm going to go ahead and let myself run down this rabbit hole for a little while. And if I waste some time, that's okay. This kind of goes counter the idea of busyness means hard work ethic, but giving yourself that level of flexibility and saying, I want to try out something and see if it works. And then if it doesn't, I can scrap it. I can let it go. I'm not going to fall for the sunk cost fallacy and think I spent hours on this. I have to figure out a way to use it. Let yourself take risks. That bridges right into the next piece of it. If you're going to have a unique voice, that means you have to be in uncharted territory by definition. You have to be willing to try things that you're not sure if they're going to work. You're not sure if people are going to respond well to it. You're not sure if it's going to catch attention. But you're never going to make something that people are going to love because it's different if you don't take these risks. So letting yourself try something that you're not sure if it's going to work is a key part of making something original. Next is mastering the form. One of my favorite quotes: anxious, inexperienced writers obey rules. Rebellious, unschooled writers break rules, and artists master the form. Right? In this section of his book, Robert McKee is talking about how there are kinds of stories that we can create, and there is a general structure to how stories work. And we have to master that. And we have to know what the quote unquote rules are. And we have to know how to use them to our goals, to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for, not the other way around. We shouldn't be subject to the rules of our trade. The rules of our trade should be subject to us. And that's how we can make something that's unique and something that's original, by mastering this form. Being an artist means we know the rules so we can break them. People that have worked with me have heard me say this a number of times. Here's two examples, right? On the left, there's two Alexes, by the way. On the left, we have one that is a circular line chart. One could say this is a circular spaghetti line chart. Spaghetti line charts are often pointed out as a breaking of data viz best practices. You shouldn't have that many lines on a chart. And then we're taking the spaghetti line chart and we're weaving it in a circle. And there's tons of best practice rules out there about how we have trouble interpreting things in a circular fashion. Lots of good psychology about how we can't break up angles and arc lengths, etc. But at the end of the day, I look at this work and I want to engage. I want to move my mouse over everything and see what highlights, what do the tooltips say. This is way more engaging to me than if it had just been laid out in a typical best practice format. Alex broke the rules and it worked. This is incredibly impactful. I would say that Alex here knew the rules and he mastered the form to make those rules work for him as opposed to the other way around. It brings meaning to me when I see all of these things in this circular pattern and all of these lines intersecting each other. And then Alex brought in the mastery of the form to give me a user interface that lets me work through each of these lines individually. And on the right, we have circles within circles. We're comparing the surface area to hemispheres of other circles, right? Everything's lined up in this circular fashion. There's so many kinds of circles in here, and meta circles, if you will, that again, we're looking at breaking rules and rules and rules, but it works. It's powerful. The response to this viz was absolutely phenomenal. And I can't get enough of looking at this visualization. It's always going to hold a spot in my mind. Again, that same idea that Alex mastered the form. He took what were our typical rules and then he went around them to create new meaning for us. Mastering the form was something that both of these individuals did to such a stellar level that, again, it made them create something original, something new, because they were in control of what these rules were and knew how to use them and knew how to break them. Things we can do to master the form. First off is study it. Watch what other artists are doing. Read reviews and critiques and analyze other works. Really critically pay attention to what those best practices are. When I was in all my poetry workshops, we were told to break the rules all the time, but a key part of that is they said you have to know them. You have to know your grammar. You have to know your syntax. Because when you're going to break that rule, it's going to have some sort of an impact. And if you don't know those rules, you're not going to know what that impact is. And at that point, you're just breaking rules because you can. But if you know the rules and you break them, there's a reason why, and the reader and the audience can intuit what you're trying to accomplish. The next thing, ironically, it sounds contradictory, is impose rules on yourself. We learn quite often in these workshops that constraints don't hinder creativity, they can actually necessitate it. A really good example in these poetry workshops is they would tell us, okay, you're gonna have to write a poem that's X number of stanzas, X lines per stanza, and it's gonna be iambic pentameter. And I hated that, right? There's this idea inside of me that I am this free-flying artist and you can't contain me, and it's a big load of crap, because really, I was lazy. I didn't want to try to be creative within these rules. That took extra hard work. So imposing rules on yourself, trying to find some sort of a restriction you want to have. Maybe it's, I want to build all of this in a certain amount of time, like Makeover Monday does. Or maybe it's, I'm going to stick to a dashboard that will be visible, the entire dashboard from a single screen and no scrolling. Creating rules like that are going to force you to be creative on how you can preserve real estate or how you can create something very quickly that's still going to be impactful, right? These rules don't prevent our creativity, but they can actually start to expand it as we start thinking about how to work within those. And the last is imitate. Find somebody in the data viz community that you like their work. Find somebody that you admire, and then try to build a piece that you think they would build. And what's really cool is you can start to see the difference. This really helps you figure out what's your own tone and voice and style as well. Because as you try to imitate their work, you're going to see things that you just can't budge. A really good example with this viz I'm going to show in a little bit on romancing the American West that I built. I got one viz into this dashboard and decided I want to make a viz like Ludovic would make. I wanted to really maximize the white space. I really want to have a key focus on a visual and a little bit of small text with a serif font. And by the time I got done with this dashboard, you could see where I tried to imitate some of what Ludovic was doing, but you could also see where my own tone, style, and voice really shone through. Now it does feel a little bit different than some of my other works, but that's a good thing, right? I'm finding this middle ground of where I can push toward other people and where I end up in between so I can better assess my own style. Next is being part of a conversation. And this one's going to break out into several pieces here. But first, this quote. I love this quote. Scott, for God's sake, write and write truly, no matter who or what it hurts, but don't make these silly compromises. Anyway, I'm damn fond of you and I'd like to have a chance to talk sometimes. We had good times talking. How is Scotty and Zelda? Pauline sends her love. Seems like a little bit of a weird quote to post in here, but the reason I did is I honestly feel like I could see this in Twitter direct messages from any number of people that went to Tableau conference and were maintaining conversation throughout the year, right? We get to know each other and we provide this feedback, and sometimes this feedback can be a little bit harsh because we know each other well enough and we have enough of a conversation to really dive into this and know these people. Last night, I was trying to tally the number of new people I've met as being part of the Tableau and data viz community and the number of new people I met at Tableau conference. And I lost track because it's intermingling with a number of people that I intend to meet in person at the new Tableau conference. So there's a lot going on there. The first conversation we want to be in is a conversation with other data viz artists. Now, we learn our art by interacting with others from our community. So a key point there is learning how to give artistic, aesthetic, and subjective feedback. And feedback's been a really hot topic in the community as of late. When do we give it? How do we give it? What kind of feedback is appropriate? And back in January, a group of us did a little experiment called the feedback loop. We named ourselves the feedback loop about the second week of the experiment. We decided to mimic the kind of workshops that I had experienced in my poetry courses and my dance courses, my photography courses. The idea that it's peer-to-peer feedback and it's focused on helping people identify the elements of their tone and their style and their voice, more of the subjective elements. And I want to provide a couple of quotes here, right? Eric Rettman, who has actually been in 2 iterations of a creative viz workshop that I've done. One was when we worked together at a previous company and now this one online. The feedback in this group has helped me identify specifics about my style that I hadn't noticed before. Knowing what my tendencies are in terms of both strengths and weaknesses provides me direction to grow. I relate to that so strongly because I mentioned that someone told me that my style is blending images with the visualization. I learned that in the feedback group. Someone pointed that out, I read it, and I went back, looked at my work, and was like, yeah, that's 100% true. I didn't realize it. And now I try to emphasize that. The next quote is from Michelle. I think one of the best things about this group has been that I am able to use thoughtful feedback from others to recalibrate my expectations and evaluations of my own work. This feedback was focused on what worked and what could be improved. And that gave me not only constructive feedback, but has also started building confidence in my own judgment, right? There's a strong idea there of where do we fit within the community and what experts do we run to for for ideas and for imitation. And one of the things I absolutely loved about my poetry workshops is getting new recommendations. You know, your art kind of feels like this, so you should check out X, right? And I get these ideas of poets I'd never heard about, read their work, fall in love, and then that would be the next person I try to imitate so I could try to master the form. We also need to converse with other types of artists. From a high level, you know, read their works on how they work. So a few really key pieces I'd love to highlight is the theory and play of the Duende by Lorca, who's an art theorist. Changed how I looked at poetry, it changed how I looked at dance, and it really changed how I looked at data visualization, even though he's not applying his ideas to that. Living Folklore, written by a professor I took her class, provides this really interesting breakdown on how individuals tend to evaluate pieces of art within communities. The idea of how much does it align with the traditions we have in our community? How original is the piece and how much effort went into it, right? 3 different dimensions which we can use to evaluate a piece of art. There's actors and screenwriters like Impro that talks a lot about how our bodies, but then consequently real estate can be used to create an energy. And Robert McKee, who I've quoted a few times, talking about what are the shapes and structures of stories and how do we master the form of those. And then poets and novelists. Kim Adonisio, Ordinary Genius, is like a series of prompts for poetry, but then also a lot of explanation of what those prompts are doing for us and how we think about the craft. And a lot of the quotes you're seeing from here are coming from her as well. And then finally, a short 4-minute video by Kurt Vonnegut, a novelist, on the simple shapes of stories, and just seeing how he broke all of these things down into small pieces is just a really interesting way to think about storytelling. So I'm learning art from all of these different artists. I'd highly recommend everybody look through these books, but there's numbers of other books, and it doesn't have to be acting or screenwriting or poetry or novels. It could be dance, it could be photography, it could be graphic design or painting, right? A number of other arts can intersect with what we're doing, and if we learn from other artists, we really can grow by applying their paradigms to ours. Then the last one is being part of a conversation through art. And I'm going to go into a few different visualizations I've made in response to art, but backing up a little bit. If you've ever looked at a piece of art and you've just thought, I don't get it. I don't get why this is hanging up on a wall in a gallery when it feels like I could have made it myself. Or when it feels like I often hear like my 3-year-old could have made this. If that's the case, odds are really good that we're missing the conversation that's happening. A really good example, there's a famous photographer that takes photographs of other photographers' work and makes it look as identical as possible. This frustrates a lot of photographers, but there's a discussion going on is this new art? Because he had to go through the entire photographic process. As much effort went into rephotographing this thing as the original photograph. Is it new art or is it not? Even think of Jackson Pollock's paintings, which a lot of people say just looks like paint slopped on a canvas. But that was really, really big when you look at the other kinds of art we have out there. All the art movements are responses to other kinds of art movements, and they can even cross mediums. So the New York School of Poetry was actually a response to the New York School of Art and the New York School of Painting. A bunch of poets looked at what these other schools were doing and said, we can have a movement like that of our own. And so now you have 5 poets that are championing a new kind of poetry with a new kind of tone, voice, and style. And I'll dive into the ways that I make visualizations that are going to respond to other kinds of art. So we'll start with the Captain Marvel viz. I'm pleased to admit that this one resulted in Viz of the Day yesterday. I also want to highlight that Captain Marvel came out on International Women's Day. And if you look through this viz, you'll see a little bit why. But the key thing here, right, is I'm highlighting what's interesting out of another piece of work, out of a comic book, right? I'm taking key stories there, but now as you move through the viz, I'm responding to key themes in the art. One of the key pieces of Captain Marvel, as long as the comic's been around, has been the idea of feminism, right? This is, at least I should say, as long as Carol Danvers has been Captain Marvel. There's been a number of other Captain Marvels, but here we're seeing a series of comics that's really about women in aviation and women shattering through glass ceilings. And I wanted to respond to that. I wanted to bring data to that conversation. And so that's what I did. I found data that aligned with these core themes in another piece of art. And then I made visuals, and I incorporated visuals from the art itself. And so now we have this blend. It's a new piece of art and a new medium responding to another piece of art. This was a really fun project to do because I got to investigate themes, the deep themes in a genre and a medium that I'm really passionate about and interested in. So one of the fun things about making data viz art in response to something else is that we really get to dive into things that we already would be passionate about. But now we're looking a little bit deeper. We're observing, we're connecting the dots and looking at the different themes and how we can replicate that in our own art. The next one was on romancing the American West. I mentioned that. Part of this was in response to some really negative publicity that John Wayne got. And that publicity was around some bigoted statements that were made. And, you know, as someone that grew up watching Westerns, I hear that a Western actor made some bigoted statements, and it's like, well, okay, you're pretty much describing the history of the genre. But I wanted to dive into some key pieces of the genre and look at the transformations of when that bigotry was addressed within the genre itself. And so I looked at different films that were produced, and especially Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles, and how that really criticized some of the bigotry. And then a while later, you had Dances with Wolves came out. And so I'm highlighting these key themes of criticizing a genre, criticizing bigotry, and then a genre coming back to respond to that. And did the genre recover? And so through this viz, you know, I continually highlight the Blazing Saddles effect and look to see, did Dances with Wolves actually recover that? This is a response to a really big movement in the genre that happened from 1975 to 1990. And I'm trying to investigate and respond to that with a work of my own. Again, our work brings data to the equation, and I wanted to really investigate that data as it pertained to the key elements of the transformation of the Western genre and what they were going through. And the last one is taking a piece of art and how those artists work and bringing that as a paradigm to our genre. So I decided to look through literature theory and then make a viz. This is really all quantitative data. Make a viz that explores the components of literary theory. What's a narrative? What's a story? How do these all work? How do we distinguish these? You know, thinking about Kurt Vonnegut's Story Shapes and Master Plots, I plugged that video in there and then looked at the idea of, here are the simple shapes of all of our stories. All stories fall within this kind of key format. And we have concepts like satellites and kernels. And you can go through this viz more and see what I pulled out from the art and from the theory, and how I connected that to data viz, and then made this to respond to another art, right? Taking another artistic paradigm and trying to apply it here, right? These are different kinds of conversations that if we want to be artists, we should look outside of just data viz, and we should be talking outside of just data viz. You know, a final piece on this is one of the most enriching things I've been able to do is be part of my local area arts council. And in being part of that, not only have I been exposed to other artists and other kinds of art, but I've also been able to vocalize what data viz is, and even make the case of data viz is an art. Make things for them to share, make things about the arts in our community and share those, right? This has been a really powerful experience because it's been two different kinds of artists talking to each other, especially when one side of the coin didn't even know that we existed. The things you can do to be part of a conversation. One is participate in data viz communities. You know, listen and figure out how all of your unique experiences create a unique perspective. No one is going to have the exact same life experiences you have, and that gives you a perspective no one else has. Figure out what that is and then vocalize it. The next one is practicing feedback. Learn to critique choices, not just checklists. So realize that when someone breaks a rule, there may have been a very intentional choice behind it. There may be a goal that you're not aware of. And that's part of what artists do. And start thinking about the choices that someone made and the potential goals they're trying to get to, as opposed to, you used red and green here. That doesn't quite seem like a good idea. There are people that are red-green colorblind. Maybe there's a reason behind that, and maybe there's more to it. And so understanding that these are choices can really help you provide better feedback that helps someone start to move in the right direction when it pertains to developing a style and a voice and a tone. The last one is seeking out other arts. If you have a local area arts council, highly recommend at least finding out more information about that and going to some events. But really read, watch, visit, attend, go to arts galleries. My local city's art gallery recently held a data exhibition where it was really a gallery devoted to art made from data. And a few of the Tableau community went there. And it was such an enriching experience to see our art celebrated, right? We were engaging with other kinds of art, and then make vizzes in response. Question what other kinds of arts are doing, whether it's, you know, the latest Avengers movie or Captain Marvel, or whether it's something more like a novel you recently read or Sherlock Holmes, right? Question some of the things that are in there, all the way down to the themes and the ideas and the morals that are put forth. The last one was having a responsibility. Kim Adonisio said description is important because it's evidence. She's talking about how poets have a responsibility to track what's happening in history and build the case of things that have happened for better or for worse. And then Robert McKee hits the nail on the head by saying we only have one responsibility: to tell the truth. He goes on to point out that one of the first things authoritarians do to establish rule is to attack the arts. It's well established in history that a dictator or tyrant will come in and say, okay, we need to either get rid of the arts, burn libraries, burn arts, tear down museums, or we're going to restrict it. So we have to put censorship on what kind of art will be available. We have to only support certain artists, and then we might exile other artists. There's this idea that art unites meaning and emotion and gives it an extra effort or an extra level of power over what other kinds of things like philosophy or normal statistics or politics might bring. And that's what makes it dangerous to authoritarians. Facts may persuade and convince us, but it's art that impassions and inspires and empowers. So if you look at some of the most powerful data vizzes we've seen out there, it's usually not just something as simple as a bar chart that lists the statistics. It's usually a bar chart plus something, or a bar chart that's formatted a certain way to call to mind certain metaphors and certain meanings, right? Bar charts aren't bad, but themselves are not going to accomplish anything. Bringing in that aesthetic element is what's really going to ignite the emotional response within us and create that inspiration and that passion. And so again, Robert McKee's quote, we have one responsibility: to tell the truth. So I want to sum it up by saying the artist, analyst, right? The primary role of the analyst is truth through accuracy. Statistics, modeling, right? Getting down to that actual confidence interval and what's the true estimate there. And then the primary role of the artist is truth through emotion, right? Uniting the meaning with the emotion in the moment as opposed to having to reflect later. And so my question then, as analyst artists, our responsibility is truth, in creating truth or creating meaning through the combination of accuracy and emotion. How do we do that? But more importantly, what is the truth you want to tell? And then how do you tell it? I don't know what that truth is for you, and I can't answer that. And truth doesn't need to be some magnificent meta thing. It can be something small. It can be something like, how has the Western film genre changed over time, given that certain movies called them out on certain bigotry? It can be something as small as, what are the patterns in the letter E, and how does that affect the evolution of language and how we think about certain words? It can be a truth that's as small as, how dangerous is it to touch a door handle after someone else has gone to the restroom, right? These are small truths, or they can be really big. It can be women's rights. It can be civil rights in general. It can be climate change. These are all different kinds of truths that we can tell, aligned with different kinds of values. And that's our responsibility, is to find our truth and then to figure out how we're going to tell it, and to tell it in a way that unites meaning and emotion. I'm going to thank everybody for attending. I'm going to pull up the Q&A here in a second. But I want to point out, as I talked about being part of a conversation with other data viz artists and learning how to give feedback, we're going to be opening up that feedback loop to a second round. And so if you're interested in joining that community and having some pieces workshopped by other artists that are just peers, and no one in that group will be considered an expert over others. If you're interested in being part of that, I just released a survey to join that and a blog post that explains a little bit about that. So you can find that post on my website listed here, or find me on Twitter. And I just tweeted something about it, or just send me a message and I'll be happy to answer that. Let's go ahead and pull up the Q&A here. I see I've got one question. So Christina is saying, "Hi Josh, I loved your talk. You mentioned the whole focus on mastering stories. I recently read 2 books about Disney Pixar's creative culture and how that helps cultivate idea generation. If you were to recommend ways to incorporate a creative culture on your work teams, what are some ways you can think to implement that feedback idea generation loop effectively?" Really good question. I'll start out by sharing an idea that is not my own. I can't take credit for it. Someone else provided it to me. We've employed it and people are loving it here. Once a week, we hold a creative or lateral thinking exercise. It's like a half hour. People gather around in the lunchroom, and we all work together through some sort of creative prompt or lateral thinking exercise. So the first week, was, here's an image. Can you write a short story based on this image? Last week, I think we did a haiku. One week, they just gave us a line chart, and it had no X or Y axis labels, and we just had to fill that in and then narrate key points on the line chart, right? These are just things that are going to get us to think in a very different way. As opposed to the ideas from the feedback loop, I think part of that is creating a format where there's not really a vertical structure for feedback, right? And I don't want to say that we can't invite bosses and executives into a room for feedback, but thinking very critically, if we're going to have an open session for feedback, who's in the room and how will they be perceived? And then once you've thought through that part of things and figured out the right participation group for that, the next spot that I'd really focus on, and something that I heard in every workshop, is focus on what works. Don't focus on rules. Don't say, well, your y-axis label needs to be oriented in a different direction, or you need to choose different colors. Those are checklists and those are rules. And your executives are going to give those to you at some point in time. And those are going to be helpful. But when you're in that meeting, ask about choices, ask a lot of questions. And when you see something that works, like, man, I really love your color palette here. You know, it makes me think, it makes me feel warm and happy and comforted. And that's what you're trying to tell with the data. I like that. You should turn the volume up on that. That's a phrase I heard in a lot of workshops, is turn the volume up. Find something that works, that represents the artist's style and tone, and ask them to turn the volume up. So maybe that color palette works for the viz. Maybe the header of my visualization should be in that color. Maybe the axes could turn that up a little bit, right? There's a lot of different ways I can turn something up, but when you point out to an artist that something's working really, really well in accomplishing a goal, that helps them know what to focus on to really drive that final success home. Are there any other questions? All right. Thank you very much again to CloudStream, the sponsor, to the entire Fringe Fest crew, and to everyone that tuned in. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. That was a really awesome talk and a perfect way to wrap up the day.